Hello, Professor.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
We're doing well. What about yourself?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, so
we should do this every week.
Don't propose that. Otherwise, you have a weekly commitment with Brazil.
Okay, good.
Okay, so thanks again, Professor. I think we're 2 minutes past 10. We already have around 50 people here. Others will join. And today's unfortunately, our last class, which we will discuss merger control and digital market. So I think it's going to be a quite interesting class. Likewise, the others, of course. But again, thanks, Professor, for making yourself available to our discussions here. And I hope everyone enjoys this class as much as they all have enjoyed the last two classes that you provide us, Professor. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to bring up my slides. Again, I'm sad that we are to the end of 3, but I'm ever so grateful for the opportunity to do this again. This is a great delight to spend time with friends and professional acquaintances. This is great fun. Let me bring up my slides, and I will be sending these along to Bruno after we're finished today. Going to turn today to merger policy. So let me go up to the top here. There we go. Okay, and get the full screen on. Excellent. Like last week, I want to start by giving you a few updates from our discussion last week. Indeed, last Tuesday, during the very presentation, the Department of Justice announced that it had filed its lawsuit against Google. A little bit about that in a moment, just what's in the case, where it's going to go. So a couple of footnotes from last week. Then turn to current merger control developments, and in doing that, I'm going to try to put recent developments in a little bit of historical context for you. Not simply because the history is interesting in its own terms, but it might foreshadow new policy developments that will be coming perhaps in a new administration with a new president and a new Congress. Maybe. But if I was good at predicting those things, I would be today at a horse racing track with a handful of winning tickets, or I would be running a fantastically successful venture financing company, and I would have bought Apple at $30 a share in 2001. And I would only be here because of my intellectual interest, not because any of us had any great financial need to do this kind of work, but a little bit about the forecast. For the format, again, about a half hour on each topic, a little bit less from the postscript, more on merger policy, and to leave us with a generous amount of time for discussion at the end of the 2-hour segment. So time for questions and comments from all of you. And I'm so happy to continue the conversation by email, at distance, by phone. I look forward to continuing the discussion over time. Okay, last week, well, all sorts of things happening every day, even during lectures themselves. I don't think there's going to be another major government case filed while we are talking today, but who knows? It's been a new development, certainly by the week. A little bit about the Google cases, the courts, with more about the elections at the very end. So you mentioned last week the DOJ Google case is underway, and state governments, a coalition of state governments, joined the Google case, about 11 of them. none of them in states in which a Democrat was the Attorney General. A large group of states where the Attorney General is a Democrat have decided, as it seems, to bring their own case, and a broader case than the DOJ case involving Google. A couple of thoughts about the DOJ case. They brought their case in Washington, D.C. That is logistically much easier for the Department of Justice to run the case from Washington. The building in which they do most of the work is a 10-minute walk at most from the front door of the courthouse. So that's a good place to be if you're running the case logistically. And it's also the court that handled the DOJ prosecution against Microsoft in the 1990s. The case filed in 1998. The Google case fits very neatly within the footprint of doctrine that the Court of Appeals in 2001 endorsed as a basis for finding liability in the Microsoft case. So what DOJ has fairly clearly done is to shape the current case as much as it can within the contours of the successful Microsoft prosecution. To do that, they limited their claims. It is a somewhat narrower case. But I think the logic of the DOJ decision is this is a case that is significant in that it could change behavior, that we could get significant remedies here, that the very fact that we are bringing the case will in some ways chasten the behavior of Google. But second, it's a case we can win. It's a case for which we have a fighting chance of success based on the success we had 2 decades ago. The principal markets at issue involve general search. The Department of Justice is asserting that general search is the principal relevant market on desktops, laptops, but also very importantly on mobile devices. There, I'm sure Google will contend aggressively whether that's too narrow. That is, should search markets be defined by reference to a larger collection of search engines that provide specialty searches for specific classes of products? And should it be expanded to take into account a larger array of search options that consumers avail themselves of in the regular use of their computers and handheld devices? That the main theory of harm is downstream foreclosure. The core of it is that Google, basically by capturing preeminent placement on handheld devices, becoming the default search on many devices, by paying a large sum for that, by using bundling and tying techniques, has essentially foreclosed rivals from the most attractive means of distributing their product to consumers. And this in many ways echoes the case that they brought against Microsoft, same basic theory. A noteworthy difference here is that in Microsoft, the government had the benefit of exceedingly powerful internal company documents, some of them offered by the chief executive, Bill Gates himself, in which Gates laid out in a very calculating and dispassionate manner the threat that the internet and middleware was posing to the traditional Windows business model, and reciting in broad terms and in specific terms the techniques that Microsoft would have to use in order to defeat this threat. So the government had the benefit of a clear statement of the exclusionary strategy and tactics. And this came forward and was reinforced in the emails of a variety of other senior Microsoft managers, including a very senior manager who described the purpose of Microsoft's response to be to cut off Netscape's air supply. That is, to disable the browser, the middleware product that they thought, initially being a complement, would become a substitute or part of a substitute package. So the government had wonderful internal Microsoft evidence. They had a chief executive who treated the lawsuit with disdain And I imagine a number of you have watched the videos of the Bill Gates deposition in the Microsoft case, where Gates is completely contemptuous of the notion of the case, acts as though he has no idea of what concepts such as market share are or dominance, and was handed one at a time documents from the DOJ lawyers saying, in this memo, you spoke of dominance, market share. What did you mean about those terms then? The district judge who heard the Microsoft case later gave an interview and said, I had basically decided after one day that I could not trust Microsoft. And that gave the government a decisive advantage. Google has clearly learned a lot from the Microsoft experience. One thing that's featured in the government's complaint is a paragraph that said, Google has been training its lawyers not to use bad antitrust language. And Google's CEO sent around a memo saying, by the way, when you write about our position, do not use the word dominance. Use the word competitive. Do not talk about markets in which we want to crush, obliterate our rivals. Talk about seeking to compete on the merits. Do not describe our purpose in life to achieve monopoly status and to control the universe. Talk about giving customers a better experience. So what Pinchai is telling his people is, these are the kinds of expressions that cause us grief in front of government agencies, and if we're in litigation, in front of juries and judges. Don't talk that way. The government singles that out and says, aha, Google is aware of its powerful position, and it is trying to clean up its language to avoid trouble. Well, those of you who've been involved in counseling clients know that this kind of advice has been a core element of compliance programs going back to the beginning of time. In my former life, long ago, in the early 1980s, when I spent 3 years with a law firm, this was a line I always had in my compliance talks, which is, don't say these kinds of things. Don't write this stuff down. And as long as there is no pending law enforcement investigation, our law firm would be glad to assist you in putting together a document retention program. That was a euphemism. Document retention meant document destruction. We will go through your files and help you pull out things that are not going to be helpful if there is ever an investigation. So the government is chiding Google for using a methodology that many of us for many years have been telling clients to do. Certainly I did long ago when I was a young lawyer getting my feet on the ground in private practice for my 3 years with the law firm. I wonder if that is a way of signaling by the DOJ that so far we have not come up with the red hot documents of the kind we had in the Microsoft case. So don't expect, maybe DOJ is saying, don't expect that kind of brilliantly articulated roadmap that describes the exclusionary strategy. We're not going to have that kind of damning evidence. We'll have to rely on something else that's not quite as flamboyant and provocative. Maybe they are saying that in shaping the case. What we know from the Microsoft case as well is that the filing of the complaint is likely to bring forward more evidence from third parties. Until the Department of Justice sued Microsoft in 1998, many of the potential victims were reluctant to cooperate. One senior DOJ official has told me about how, in the preparation of the case, he would go to Palo Alto and meet in obscure coffee shops in hidden parts of the shops late at night to meet with potential witnesses. And what they all said is, until we are convinced that you are credibly committed to this lawsuit, we're not going to play. We are not going to surface our opposition and have our heads taken off by a very determined and ruthless opponent. We will not do that. It was only when DOJ filed the case that people came forward and said, we are with you to the end of the line. We will testify as witnesses. We will provide information. We will assist you in a visible way. In other words, the evidence that DOJ had when the trial itself began was a lot better than the evidence had when it filed the complaint. Perhaps that will against Google as well. The DOJ complaint in the last section, that's section 8 of the complaint, it's about 65 pages altogether, in very sketchy terms lays out its remedial intentions. It simply mentions that we want an injunction to stop the bad behavior. We may seek structural relief, and we may seek preliminary relief to arrest behavior that is underway, and we want to stop before the end of the trial. That's it. Now, this is typical government practice. In the Microsoft case, DOJ was even more cryptic. It said, we want injunctive and other appropriate relief, period. It only revealed its immediate remedial desires at the end of the case when the remedy phase came closer and closer. So this is a more complete revelation of remedial intentions, but it doesn't tell us what specific forms of structural relief might be necessary to deal with, for example, the effects of Google making huge payments to equipment manufacturers to become the default on the device, which they've done. Google, by the way, says in the grocery store world, those are called slotting allowances, and they happen all the time. That's what people do to get a good space on the shelf. DOJ's apparent response to that will be, only you have staggering monopoly profits, billions every month, that you can apply to that purpose. I suppose the largest defense that's going to be mounted by Google here is, why do people use our search engine? Because they like it, because we give them the best product possible. And a suggestion here is going to be that even if you impose limits on conduct, perhaps even if you do some divestitures, people will still come back and find us because they like us. That has been their habit. That has been their practice. DOJ, by contrast, is going to say they stick with you because switching itself is sticky. People could do it, they don't do it. So this becomes an interesting arena in which to look at some of the theory from behavioral economics that compares and focuses on the difference between what people in principle could do and what they actually do in practice. That question about stickiness of user behavior is a very central element of the debate that's going to unfold in the courtroom. The case has been assigned to a very good district judge, Judge Amit Mehta. Judge Mehta knows something about competition law. He was the judge in a successful effort by the FTC to block a merger in the food services business called Cisco. He presided over the case, found that the FTC had established his case. So I think he's going to have a good understanding of the basic vocabulary of the field, and is going to be able to tell the parties, let's get down to business. And I also assume he's going to use techniques that other judges, some in his court, in other courts, have used to accelerate the proceeding of the case. That is, all direct evidence submitted in writing. The only live taking of evidence would be cross-examination by the lawyers in the US context. That, in other words, he will use methods to try to bring this case along. I suspect in the relatively near future, he will schedule a conference with the representatives of the parties to discuss the schedule, to look at his own calendar, to think, when can I fit this in, to begin a trial in 2021 with an aim, I think, to bring it to a close in 2020. So it's a ways to go, but a very interesting beginning in the lawsuit. And again, the state government said in an interview that took place after our meeting last Tuesday, in a subsequent webinar, and featuring Philip Weiser, who's the Attorney General for the state of Colorado, who is basically heading the effort of other states that want a broader case. Phil Weiser said, "We expect to bring our investigation to a close within the next few weeks," which suggests to me that certainly by the end of this calendar year, the state governments will bring their own broader case against Google, which will probably be under the federal rules of civil procedure in the United States, will be consolidated with the government's case in Washington and will be tried by the same judge. So we will likely have the same judge looking at this constellation of claims involving improper exclusion by Google. One other development, this from last night, that's Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Until yesterday evening, she was Judge Amy Coney Barrett of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. She is now Justice Barrett and brings the complement of Supreme Court membership to its full strength of 9 members. She does not have an extensive record of decision-making in antitrust cases as a judge, but I think it is fair to say that her view of economic regulation is in many ways a skeptical one. So she joins an existing majority of court members, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, already skeptical of expansive antitrust enforcement. She reinforces that. So the antitrust and economic regulation skeptics now have 6, a more reliable margin than 5. It doesn't mean that they are inflexibly opposed to antitrust enforcement. They have voted for, individually or as a group, antitrust findings of liability, or they voted for plaintiffs in matters involving process and procedure. But essentially what they have done is to tell plaintiffs, and certainly government agencies in other regulatory proceedings, we are not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. We are not going to read statutes broadly to infer powers and authority that do not appear in the text of statutes. We are not going to assume that your theories about intervention are ordinarily well-grounded. You're going to have to earn everything you get. So it means that the Donald Trump Department of Justice that brought this lawsuit, if it makes its way all the way through the courts, through the more favorable and welcoming environment of the U.S. District Court, then the Court of Appeals that decided the Microsoft decision, the next stop is the large white courthouse in back of our U.S. Capitol. That's the Supreme Court. And that could very well turn out to be a difficult encounter. Not impossible, but it's a long, hard climb. And Justice Barrett's arrival on the court reinforces a majority that's going to make the government work very hard for anything it gets. On to merger review, to talk a bit about merger control and to look at how it's working in digital markets. And here the interesting question again is, in the enforcement process, possibly through legislation, is this system going to expand? What I'm going to do here is give you a sense of the overall framework in which merger control takes place in the US, a bit of a refresher for you. A quick look at how doctrine has evolved in directions that are non-intervention minded, that impose tough burdens on government plaintiffs, and to talk about a couple of recent cases and policy developments that sought to extend the frontier, but at least with litigation have not had a lot of success doing it. The statutory framework you're familiar with. The main instrument of control is the Clayton Act as amended in 1950 by the Seller-Kefauver Act and enforced through the Hart-Scott-Rodino pre-merger review mechanism that sets the framework in the United States for mandatory notification and a suspensory period. That statute is 45 years old next year. in 2021. That's the statute that became the model for global adoption of pre-merger notification. It started with Hart-Scott. A statutory development I'm going to mention here, it's hard to find a large number of specific instances in which it has been applied, but there has been a gradual extension of the US mechanism, often referred to as ex florio, that permits a separate national security review of proposed mergers. And the instrument that carries that out in the United States is the Council on Foreign Investment in the United States, known by its acronym CFIUS. There's been a gradual extension of this mechanism to pick up a larger range of transactions that arguably pose a threat to national security. In the early stages, the system seemed focused on mergers that affected the production and development of national security related systems or components, such as the construction of sensors that go in reconnaissance satellites that take pictures from 150 to 400 miles above the Earth's surface, or simply listen. It's been expanding to adopt a broader notion of what constitutes national security, increasing examination of infrastructure, electronic systems infrastructure and transmission. And at a time when globalization has been taking a battering in the United States, and Democrats and Republicans have expressed greater and greater concern about reliance on supply chains that originate outside the United States and in many instances are based in countries that do not necessarily have a deep abiding affection for the United States, that there should be a growing degree of scrutiny when those enterprises go into the market to buy and sell firms, and in particular when the buyer is a state-owned or heavily state-influenced enterprise. Yes, that focuses first and foremost on the People's Republic of China. And even if Mr. Biden wins, it's entirely possible that we will see somewhat greater expansion of the application of this mechanism, given the relatively bad environment already for trade, certainly from the point of view of the United States, and a strained relationship with China. Will the Biden team seek to ameliorate some of the differences there? I suspect they will, but there is such a keen concern in the US, a bipartisan concern, that trade with China has disadvantaged American firms, that there will be considerable pressure and temptations to apply the CFIUS mechanism more broadly. And I think in many countries, we see variants of this emerging. There is a form of arms race in which if one country builds a strong national security screen, others follow and say, we're going to do the same. We see that in Europe as well as in the United States. Section 7 of the Clayton Act is the core. This was amended dramatically in 1950. The standard is maybe substantially to lessen competition. Congress, by the way, is proposing to change this. This is part of the legislative package that the House subcommittee that I mentioned before in the first presentation is thinking about adopting. Basically, to eliminate the substantiality requirement, to avoid any suggestion that there must be a probable or likely effect, and to focus more on possible effects. The exact drafting of that legislation remains to be seen, but Congress seems to be poised, many of its members, to change the basic command to allow the government to attack deals that have a somewhat less certain and perhaps more speculative adverse effect on competition. The older meaning given to this may-be language, as intended by Congress, was to make this a very incipient safeguard and to stop trends towards concentration, which Congress defined broadly but did not put in the text of the statute. The modern meaning has walked away from that original incipiency meaning. It still focuses on predictable competitive effects, It recognizes that there's going to have to be some experimentation and figure out where to draw the lines. But very significantly, the tendency in the courts over the last 40 years has been to impose greater demands on the government in establishing the likelihood of adverse effects. One important element of the statute that I'll come back to later is that deals that are consummated are fair game for enforcement, including since 1970 adopted the Hart-Scott notification framework. The fact that the government agencies have not challenged a deal when the deal was proposed, that they let the waiting periods lapse, does not create a legal barrier to a subsequent challenge. So if the Federal Trade Commission were to decide, God, we made a terrible mistake in letting Facebook buy Instagram, or letting Google buy DoubleClick, nothing in the law prevents the agencies after the fact from coming back and saying, we now realize that those mergers substantially lessen competition and we want to unwind them. And there's a lot of talk now about doing that. So in the United States, the fact that your deal closes without challenge does not mean in some lasting sense that you are done when it comes to antitrust reviews. That power to look back and unwind has not been used in a large number of matters, but it's there. And there are powerful demands now in the political process to the government agencies to go use it more often. Go fix the mistakes that you created by being too permissive in reviewing deals when they were proposed to you. Again, in the US regime, the courts are a vital mechanism for determining how that broad command at the top of the slide will be applied. And we'll see that there's been quite an evolution in how they do that. The agencies have issued guidelines, the US merger guidelines, most recently new vertical guidelines issued in June of this year to inform that process. The guidelines in the United States, as you know, are not law. They are not statutory text. They are not implementing secondary legislation. They are guidelines. A joke that lawyers sometimes use in their compliance talks in the US is to say, when God gave the famous tablets to Moses, he called them the 10 Commandments. He did not call them the 10 Guidelines. Well, these are guidelines. They are not legally binding commandments, but the government issues them to influence the way courts think about mergers, and they have been influential. The vertical merger guidelines issued in June seek to expand the envelope of enforcement and to give that signal to courts. Who can sue you in the US? It's easier to come up with a list of people who cannot sue you in the US than the list of people who can. It's a long list. The two federal agencies that allocate individual mergers. Federal sectoral regulators like the communications regulator have a competition mandate in their public interest command to review mergers. State attorneys general can challenge deals that the federal agencies haven't challenged or have resolved with settlements that the states regard to be inadequate. For sectoral merger control, state replicas of the federal sectoral regulators also have competence to challenge mergers where the companies operate within the state boundaries. And if all of the public institutions do nothing, private rights of action are still possible. And we will see in a bit a fairly powerful example of that at work. And that doesn't even start looking at the international world that we're familiar with. The gauntlet of sometimes dozens of jurisdictions outside of one's own country with which one has to negotiate the review of the deal and obtain clearance. The HSR process, the statutes adopted in '76 and the implementing legislation, the regulation is put in place in 1978. Mandatory notification for certain deals, and it defines which deals are reportable basically by reference to assets and size of the transaction. A crucial ingredient of merger review is what are called 4C documents. There is a specification in the reporting form that says you have to give us all company records related, among other things, to the preparation of the transaction and the rationale for its accomplishment. Any minutes, notes prepared by the board, memos that went to senior leadership saying this is why we're doing this. Quite significantly, those documents often are the trigger of a deeper second phase investigation that's called the second request. It's the memo that goes to the board or to the CEO that says, why are we spending so much money on this? Because it's going to give us market power. That's why. Those kinds of documents, as you might imagine, provide a wet, glistening look on the cheeks of the Department of Justice and FBI. That's what you like to see in setting out your investigation plan. There's an initial waiting period of 30 days for hostile tender offers. It's shorter, it's 20. DOJ and the FTC allocate the cases. They do negotiations over who'll do what. Sometimes these are bitter hand-to-hand combat. If the agency at the end of 30 days wants to get more information, they have to notify the parties and say, this is what we want. That's usually called the second request. If the parties get a second request, upon compliance, company certifies, says we've given you all that you asked for, and the clock runs. That clock runs for 30 more days, within which time the government has a decision to make about, most important, whether it will go to federal court to challenge the deal. If either agency wants an injunction to stop the deal, it must go to federal court. The FTC also has the option of going through its own administrative process and to review the transaction after it has been completed, and then to decide whether through that administrative process, whether it wants to impose a divestiture or other relief. But if US agencies want to block deals, they must go to court first. Again, what about unchallenged deals? Very important to the tech sector these days. In the business press and in colloquial conversations about merger review, lawyers, academics, and others often talk about the agencies clearing a deal. In Europe and in many other countries, that has a technical meaning. Cleared means comfort. Clear means we didn't challenge it now and we're not going to challenge it later. Go ahead. The US does not have clearance in that sense. Does not. When the waiting period runs out, or if the agency has decided before the waiting period that it's not going to act, it sends counsel for both of the merging parties a letter that says, we're letting you know that we are not going to sue you now. Go ahead and close if you like. It does not say, we are not going to sue you now and we will not sue you later. The traditional interpretation of that letter has been, we're not going to sue you later. That the agencies realized that if this mechanism became a perpetual system of initial review and then come back at it again in a later lawsuit, that the predictability that Hart-Scott sought to achieve would be lost. So the traditional interpretation of that letter that says, we're not going to sue you now, has been, we're not going to sue you later either. Go ahead. Sleep well. Don't have nightmares about a later DOJ or FTC lawsuit. Technically, the law does not mean we will not sue you later. There is no statute of limitations to challenge a merger. You can reach back as far as you like. If you were really bold about that, I think a court might not look at your case favorably. But there's no bar to going back to unwind a deal. The emerging possibility is that the agency will say, we looked at it before, but we missed the call. We're like a referee in a sporting match. We blew it. We should have called a foul, but we didn't do it. And now we're going to go back and fix the mistake. We're going to reevaluate, and if we find a problem, we will seek structural remedies to unwind the deal. And that means a lot for tech companies that have been rolling up a lot of smaller firms over the last 20 years, especially in the last decade. This is a development featured prominently in the House Subcommittee Staff Majority Report that basically looks at the antitrust agencies. They have an appendix at the back of that report that's worth looking at. It lists dozens upon dozens of deals that the big guys have carried out, and it notes you, the agencies, didn't challenge any of these. What were you doing? Why do we pay your salaries? And the implication there is that you ought to be willing to go back and do this. Now, the agencies have challenged consummated deals, but those usually fell below the reporting thresholds. One that did not fall below the reporting thresholds was an FTC challenge to a merger involving hospital systems in Chicago, where the FTC waved it through and then realized afterwards that the transaction was having notable adverse price effects, and it came back and challenged the deal. The most interesting recent development involves a private suit. This is a merger involving the production of what are called door skins. These are the metal strips that go around a door when it's put in a doorway to provide a good seal in the door. Door skins. Steves and Sons versus Jeld-Wen. It's a private case. This was not challenged by the public agencies. The transaction took place in 2012. The plaintiff sues in 2016 to challenge it. In the district court trial, the court of first instance, the court finds an infringement and orders divestiture. This is 6 years after the merger in a private case. This is being appealed to the Court of Appeals. The relevant Court of Appeals is the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. The Department of Justice has entered an appearance as a friend of the court on the appeal and said, we're only giving you our views about the availability of divestiture as a remedy in a private case for a consummated merger. Our view is the law allows it. So whatever decision you reach, DOJ is telling the appellate court, whatever decision you reach, do not reject divestiture because you perceive it is lawfully barred here, that the law does not permit a private party to get divestiture to challenge a consummated transaction. We see no barrier, so do not be inhibited about the imposition of the remedy there. We should see a decision in this case probably before the end of this calendar year. This is all to suggest that modern policy debate and some recent litigation, especially Jeld-Wen, suggests that just because your deal didn't attract a challenge during the Hart-Scott waiting periods does not mean that it will not attract a challenge later on. There's a lot of pressure to go back and look at these transactions. Who gets involved in merger review? Congress is actively involved. It writes to the agencies, it calls them up. For major mergers, on the day it was announced, I started getting phone calls when I was at the FTC on the board. I got calls when I was merely a commissioner. I got more calls when I was the chair. Legislators call up and say, here's my view. Why are mergers such visible events? It doesn't take long for elected officials to figure out whether their constituency is likely to gain or lose jobs. They have a sense right away of where the jobs are going to go. If they're going to get them, they're happy with the deal. If they're going to lose them, they are most disagreeable. The merging parties, of course, are involved. The merging parties prepare their strategy by going to the federal regulators and to the state regulators, both the antitrust authorities and the sectoral regulators. And there are very specialized practices now that involve going to specific categories of regulatory overseers. And then, of course, there's a massive collection of external advisors, competition lawyers, regulatory agency lawyers, economic consultants, lobbyists, media consultants. The planning meetings that these groups hold in the days when people got together face to face would fill relatively sizable auditorium-sized rooms. That's what you had to do to fit them all in. But political pressure hovers around this process. The question is in the United States is not, is there political pressure? That's like asking, is there oxygen in the air? Yeah, it's all around you. It's enveloping. The issue is, how do you cope with it? How does the agency deflect it in order that it can do its job without specific outcomes being dictated by powerful elected officials? I'm going to talk a bit about enforcement trends because this is part of the modern story about pressure to do more. The key period of Supreme Court interpretations of the 1950 amended merger law take place in a 13-year period between 1962 and 1975. The first interpretation of the 1950 amendments takes place in 1962. And the last Supreme Court decision on substantive merger standards took place in 1975. I'm not beyond including typos in slides, but that's not a typo. The most recent Supreme Court decision that deals with substantive merger control standards was issued in 1975. That is more distant than the time of birth for a number of people in our audience today. 45 years of Supreme Court silence. More about that in a moment. What was the state of the law the last time they talked about it? These are some principles you would extract from their jurisprudence. And this was the advice that lawyers gave their clients. At what point will a horizontal merger attract scrutiny, challenge, with the approval of the courts? A merger that produces a post-acquisition market share of 4.49%. There again, I have not committed a typographical error by putting the decimal point in the wrong place. That's not 44.9, it's 4.49%. What about a vertical merger? A vertical foreclosure of 2% in an upstream or downstream market created an almost irrebuttable presumption of illegality. That's right, 2%, not 20, 2. Conglomerate mergers, close scrutiny. The government brought lots of those cases, won some of them, had a mixed litigation record. Efficiencies, they don't count. And on a bad day, if you make efficiency arguments, they will count against you because they will be seen as the means by which you acquire the capacity to engage in predation against the survivors in the industry. So don't talk about efficiencies at all. What about a merger in which I arguably have some possibility of competitive harm in one market in which I operate, but the merger affects another market in which I'm going to generate big efficiencies? Do I get to take the efficiency gains in one market and use them to offset or overcome the finding of harms in another market? Supreme Court's answer, decisively no. If there is any harm in any market, that establishes the requisite anti-competitive effect. You cannot take the credits of possible effects in other markets and use them to offset the negative effects in another market. And what are the goals? The court said, we happily, willingly give up efficiencies in order to have a more egalitarian business environment. So if you're telling us that the merger, if it goes ahead, is going to produce great efficiency benefits for consumers, and that denying the merger is going to prevent consumers from getting those benefits, the response of the Supreme Court was, we don't care. That's what Congress wanted. Here are a couple of indications of the formative jurisprudence. I'm going to show you cases that the Supreme Court has never repudiated. In that period since 1975, again, no merger cases in which the Supreme Court has ever said, these things that you will see on the next slides don't count anymore. We just don't believe that. Here's Brown Shoe. This is a merger of shoe production and retailing takes place in the 1950s. The Department of Justice sues to block it. The court of first instance agrees, and the Supreme Court endorses the finding of illegality. Court says, what about this statute, 1950, that's supposed to cure incipient problems, to stop trends towards concentration? At the bottom of the slide, I note for you that the post-acquisition market share of shoe production was about 5% in this transaction. 5% post-acquisition market share. The court says, we cannot avoid the mandate of Congress that tendencies toward concentration are being accelerated through giant steps, striding across 100 cities at a time. 5% post-acquisition market share. In light of the trends in this industry, did I say a 5% post-acquisition market share? The trends, the court's alarmed by this trend. We agree with the government and the court below that this is an appropriate place at which to call a halt. You're not going to go farther by creating a firm with a 5% market share. That would have made Brown the second largest shoe producer. The leading producer had about 7%. Court says, this is the place to draw the line. If we don't stop it here, it gets out of hand. So block it now. 5%. What about the goals of merger policy? Well, the parties, this was also a vertical transaction. It was going to join up what was mainly a shoe producer, Brown, with Kinney, which mainly had retail operations. Vertical foreclosure, incremental effect, 2%. Of course, the Supreme Court says some of the results of large integrated or chain operations are beneficial to consumers. It's good for them. We agree with you. You've given us a nice story about how you're going to produce more shoes, sell them, take great production, great distribution, and sell more shoes. Their expansion is not rendered unlawful by the mere fact that small independent stores may be adversely affected. In the English language, one of the most wonderful words is this one, mere, this four-letter word, mere fact. It leads you to ask, well, what beyond this mere fact would be important? The court tells us right now, it is competition, after all, not competitors, which the law protects. But we cannot fail to recognize Congress's desire to promote competition through the protection of small, locally owned business. Congress appreciated that occasional higher costs and prices might result from the maintenance of fragmented industries and markets. It resolved these competing considerations in favor of decentralization. We must give effect to that decision. So for the sake of a more egalitarian business environment, small, locally owned businesses, fragmented industries and markets, we willingly sacrifice efficiencies that are beneficial to consumers because that's the choice Congress wanted us to make. By the way, don't tell us too much about your efficiencies here either, because we don't care. The court specifically addresses merger efficiency arguments in other cases. The most important and pointed is 1967. The Federal Trade Commission sues Procter & Gamble to stop it from buying a liquid bleach company known as Clorox. Procter & Gamble, the globally famous producer of consumer goods, did not produce any bleach. Clorox made bleach. Procter & Gamble said, that's a nice addition to our portfolio. Household care products, we'll buy the bleach. We have a great marketing system around the world. We can sell anything to anybody. Now we'll sell more bleach. And certainly this won't cause a problem. There's no horizontal overlap. Nobody's arguing that we could have entered the bleacher market, that we were going to. It's not a potential competition case. It's not a vertical case. This isn't an input or an output. This is a conglomerate acquisition. We're going to pick up a complement to our existing portfolio of products, bleach. And they explained to the court, let me tell you why this is good. We're going to take our great marketing system and sell through it a great product for which Clorox does not have a good marketing mechanism. We're great at marketing. They're not. So we're going to sell a lot more bleach. Output will go up. Good for consumers, because when the output goes up, what happens to the price? Usually down. Supreme Court, possible efficiencies cannot be used as a defense to illegality. In effect, the court was saying, sit down, counselor. Stop. Stop right there. You can imagine in the next case, counselor, are you going to tell us about the efficiency benefits of the merger? Save your breath. We don't care. We will give you a cold cup of coffee right now. We will validate your parking pass for the garage, and we will send you out the door. We do not want to hear about efficiencies. They're irrelevant. Philadelphia National Bank, earlier in the decade, Department of Justice challenge to a bank merger. One of the arguments the parties made was that we're really combining depository institution, checking account type banks with larger enterprises that do, in many instances, commercial banking. Loans to big companies. What this is going to do is increase our ability to get deals that involve loans, lending to big companies. We're going to be able to compete more effectively with the big financial institutions in New York. That's what we're going to do. I mean, we dispute the idea there's going to be an adverse effect anywhere. But even if there were, for sake of argument, say in some of the depository banking activities, that's way offset by the gains in competition involving larger loans to larger borrowers. PNB, the Supreme Court, an otherwise anti-competitive merger is not saved because on some ultimate reckoning of social economic debits and credits it may be deemed beneficial. We're not going to take the benefits in one market and weigh them off against the harms in another. If there are harms in any one market proven, we're done. That's the requisite illegality. The court says, here's why. A value choice of such magnitude is beyond the ordinary limits of judicial competence. Oh God, it's too hard. We can't do it. We don't know how. And in any event, it has already been made for us by the Congress. In our view, the legislation does not permit that kind of trade-off. So do not tell us about how the harm in one area is offset by the benefits in the others. As you can gather here, that's not a very welcoming treatment of efficiency arguments. And that's the last thing the Supreme Court had to say about substantive merger standards. The lower courts have had a lot of other things to say, though. Horizontal mergers. That original presumption, let's look at that again, 4.49%. What's happened in the lower court since in their jurisprudence? The structural presumption of illegality basically works for mergers that consolidate the number of producers from 3 to 2 or 2 to 1. And if we're really knocked out by your evidence predicting competitive effects, internal company records, maybe we'll block 4 to 3. But that's it. We're not going to block 11 to 5, 11 to 10. That's the earlier jurisprudence. What about vertical deals? Lower courts often presume them to be beneficial, benign, curing double marginalization. FTC, DOJ, practice has been to approve deals with a foreclosure that's at or above 30%. That's a little bit above 2%, 30%. And when the government has tried to get back into the vertical merger enforcement game, more about this case later, in 2018, 2019, it sued to block Time Warner from merging with AT&T. This was a vertical transaction. The district court upheld the court of first instance decision not to block the transaction. This was the first litigated government vertical merger case since the late 1970s. 40 years since one had been litigated. Arguably an admirable effort to get back in the litigation game on this, but the court of first instance makes very, very demanding assumptions about what the government has to prove to show illegality. And the Court of Appeals does not tamper with that decision. And what about efficiencies? Welcome. Tell us your story, please. Now, what weight we give to them depends on how good your evidence is, but of course you can make these arguments. And sometimes they're decisive. And the government's merger guidelines welcome that evidence too. A trick you can play in a US classroom where you have students who are at the graduate level studying antitrust law from other countries is you take one group of them and have them read these Supreme Court cases. You say, read that, read all of these, read Brown Shoe, read Procter & Gamble, read Philadelphia National Bank, and tell me what the existing state of jurisprudence is. And when they do that, if they've done a good job, they come up with a chart that looks about like that. And they've done it right. And if you say, give me some memorable quotations that spell out the state of mind and methodology of the courts, they'll give you stuff like this. Then you take another group that says, I want you just to read lower court merger decisions, nothing else, from, say, 1980 to the present, and give me a snapshot of what that jurisprudence says. Well, it looks like this. Structural presumption, 3-2, maybe 4-3. 2-1. Vertical deals, the government doesn't bring those cases anymore. They don't litigate them. They take settlements. And they don't worry unless the foreclosure is above 30%. And the clear attitude of the government and the courts is that vertical deals are usually good. They cure transaction cost problems. They get rid of double marginalization. That's all good for consumers. Well, what about efficiencies? Bring them in. Present your evidence. It's all relevant. You bring those two groups together, you can take a third group and say, read the government's merger guidelines, and they sort of track the positive view of efficiencies, the positive view of vertical mergers. Where are we going to require second requests? Maybe 6-5, 4-3. Where do we usually sue you? 4-3, 3-2, 2-1. And you ask them to have a chat, and the reaction of the Supreme Court team is, isn't all of this civil disobedience? Where in the world do the courts and enforcement agencies get the idea that they can ignore that, or ignore that, or ignore that, or ignore that? This, in part, is what the neo-Brandeisians that we talked about on the first lecture have been saying is, this is what the law ought to be. And with God as our witness, if we ever get power again, that is going to be the reset. That's where we're going. And we will reform the law. We will change the agencies to say, that's what you do and not that. That is civil disobedience. That is not the vision of merger control that Congress had in mind. That's the big debate coming ahead. Regardless of who wins the election, if Mr. Biden wins, it will be a more intense debate. And Congress very well might enact legislation to try to reset, certainly for acquisitions involving dominant firms. I mean, an example of the earlier view of this change of mind, I just want to mention one earlier case. It's called Baker Hughes. It involves petroleum exploration and drilling equipment. The Department of Justice challenged a deal that had a post-acquisition HHI well into the 4,000s. A highly concentrated traded merger. At best, 4-3. And the DOJ relied mainly on the structural presumption, but it had other evidence about entry. The party said, oh, we have power buyers here. Who are the buyers for this stuff? It's ExxonMobil, it's Chevron, it's Royal Dutch Shell. They push back, they get good deals. We're no threat to them. The parties won at the trial. The parties prevailed on these arguments. And the Court of Appeals says, oh, that structural presumption, the numbers themselves don't mean that much to us. If all you, the government, do is to rely on the structural data, then the burden of rebuttal is weaker for the merging parties. And this Court of Appeals made relatively clear that the structural presumption only has real power at 3-2 or 2-1. Not much beyond that. That's almost conclusive at 3-2 or 2-1. But below that, it's qualified by this other evidence. The opinion is a jarring rebuke of the Department of Justice. The last footnote of the opinion says, why are you wasting your resources bringing these clumsy cases just based on the numbers? Well, let's see. Why do we do it? Maybe because Philadelphia National Bank told us to. Maybe because the Supreme Court decisions, 62-75, said we could. And by the way, in the organization of the judiciary, with the greatest respect, it appears to us as though you are below them in the hierarchy. That's why we did it. The Department of Justice does not seek review of this decision by the Supreme Court. I think they were afraid that the Supreme Court would say, we've changed our mind. That goes for us too. Just a word about who sat in this case. Clarence Thomas, David Santel, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late now Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Clarence Thomas and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, after this decision, get promotions to the Supreme Court. And Thomas is still there. If we would have had a case in which Ginsburg sat on the Supreme Court, I doubt that she would have repudiated what she did with the Court of Appeals. So this is a very centrist, left of center member of the court joining arms with two arch conservatives. Now you can imagine Thomas doing this, but what is lovely, sweet RBG doing hanging around with these people in this merger case? Yet she did. Justice Breyer appeared at a symposium in 1914 at my law school, at a symposium looking at the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. And he was asked, when are you guys ever going to decide a merger case again? When? And he said, we can only decide the cases that are brought to us. And if the government does not appeal these cases to us, we can never take one. We can't make up our own cases. We cannot offer advisory opinions. Got to have a case. And he said, I'd love to have a merger case. And I suspect others on the court would too. But especially until the government brings one to them, that won't happen. Although in this private case involving Genweld and Steves, if that case is decided in favor of the plaintiffs in the Court of Appeals, I think the defendant's going to go to the Supreme Court. It could be this private case seeking divestiture in a consummated merger that could be the vehicle for the restatement of what merger control should mean for the future. But that case isn't before the Supreme Court yet. So, silence, 45 years of silence. Now, there have been, since 1975, a lot of Supreme Court decisions that raise questions about the attitude of these earlier merger cases. They are not merger cases. They are famous cases like Sylvania that say, what counts in Sherman Act analysis? Microeconomic policy effects. If you want to talk to us about a theory of harm, talk to us about microeconomics. in effect, the court's saying, don't bring us this stuff about small, locally owned businesses. We don't want to hear about that. Fragmented industries, spare us. God, don't make me listen to that. The court has not joined up these non-merger cases with a merger case, but one imagines that they'll rethink the framework that they laid out from 62 to 75. But what's going to bring the case there? How's that going to happen? Could be the next one on the runway would be this private case. They can't review cases that they don't have. And many of us believe, yes, they'll do a significant rewrite of the earlier jurisprudence. How they'll do it? Hard to tell. Where will they draw the lines? Hard to tell. Is there any of the egalitarian vision that they will embrace? Any element of it? Hard to tell. They haven't spoken of those values in ages. The federal agencies continue to have a big policymaking role. HSR converted merger control in many ways to a negotiation over settlements. And the government does issue guidelines. These are not binding, but they are influential. In the most recent set, 2020, new vertical merger guidelines. The government updated their horizontal guidelines in 2010. Now, the set of guidelines that were issued in 1984 have been upgraded. Just a word about remedies. Oh, let me pick up the vertical merger. There we go. I'm going to talk about this for a second. The vertical guidelines. All right. The new guidelines. They're more skeptical about vertical deals. Generally, their attitudes changed. You know, the older point of view is that vertical deals, wow, usually benign or pro-competitive. These guidelines don't say that. They say we're going to look, and we're going to focus on the ability and incentive of the merging parties to use foreclosure techniques that raise rivals' costs. This is basically a raising rivals' cost framework. And we're going to look. The draft of this set of guidelines contained a foreclosure safe harbor of 20%, basically. The final guidelines got rid of it. There was a lot of critical commentary that said, get that out of there. And they embraced it. So no comforting safe harbor toward the lower fifth of the foreclosure spectrum. And on efficiencies, the government has said, in a real departure from past practice, if you're going to come in and talk about double marginalization, bring your proof. We'd like a convincing calculation of what those effects are going to be, and we will evaluate ourselves whether we think that calculation is appropriate. There's nothing in the guidelines about remedies, and that may be because there is a continuing disagreement between the Department of Justice and the FTC about when you should demand structural remedies or just block deals outright, or whether you should contemplate conduct remedies that involve, for example, a non-discrimination mandate or a firewall that keeps one part of a company from learning what it obtains by way of information from another part of the company. 2 FTC commissioners dissented fairly strongly against the FTC acceptance of the guidelines. These are joint guidelines, DOJ, FTC. The FTC approved them by a 3-2 vote. These are the 2 Democrats on the commission. Both of them, I suspect, would welcome a promotion to be chair in a Biden administration. Chopra is essentially a protege of Elizabeth Warren, much more closely aligned with the neo-Brandeisians. Slaughter is a bit more moderate. She is the protege of Charles Schumer, who, if the Democrats gain control of the Senate, will be the Senate Majority Leader. So we'll also have a voice in the debate. So the new guidelines say we're going to look more carefully and routinely at vertical mergers. Talk a bit more about AT&T Time Warner. This was essentially a vertical transaction that combined the production of content with distribution. The parties offered behavioral solutions, all kinds. The kind of behavioral solutions, non-discrimination requirement, obligation to deal with third parties for a period of time. They also included an arbitration offer that said, we will arbitrate with all downstream parties any argument over the pricing of content, and it would be Time Warner content. We agree to arbitrate, and we will never black somebody out. We won't withhold service. We will always go into arbitration. At an earlier time, DOJ probably would have taken the behavioral solutions. They did not here. They said, we are demanding a prohibition because we don't think there's a behavioral deal. And we don't see a good structural solution, so we're moving a block. So the first time in 40 years, we're going to be in the courtroom. They lost. The district court emphasized new competition from the Netflix of the world, going beyond the traditional cable networks and other direct distribution networks that AT&T and Time Warner between them would have controlled. So there's new competition, and all this merger is trying to do is meet that. That Netflix is the over-the-top solution of the future. They also believed that AT&T would not have the ability to raise prices for Time Warner content and what are thought to be must-have Time Warner products like CNN on the news side. And said, a lot of sports programming too. Said, we don't think they can do that. We don't think they will do that. The government came back and said, of course they will. And they've done it before. The government offered quantitative proof. The court said, we're not persuaded. We see problems with your economic model. The government's main witness was Carl Shapiro. He relied in turn on a study done by another researcher, and they attacked the integrity of the other study and said it doesn't provide the quantitative foundation that Professor Shapiro is invoking here to support his theory. The district court had questions, and the district court said, this no blackout arbitration offer, that's impressive. That makes us think there's not going to be competitive harm, because essentially what the parties have said is we will not use this gun at the head threat to withhold must-have content in order to get you to accept a higher price. We're not going to do that. Court of Appeals did not quarrel with this line of analysis and upheld it. DOJ decided we're not going to try to get review by the Supreme Court. Probably a wise choice, because the findings of the district court and its ruling very much intimately tied up with its findings of fact, which the Second Circuit was not going to upset. The appellate court was not going to rethink those findings. As a consequence, the matter ends after the Court of Appeals. The district judge, in his opinion, has a very defensive passage that says to the parties, to the government, by the way, if I were you, I would not appeal my ruling. Don't do that. It's going to be a waste of time. It's going to be really expensive. An outside observer might say, that's the kind of thing judges write when they're afraid they might not have made the right call. Don't appeal. Don't seek review. Oh, really? Because you did such a great job? That's a pretty defensive paragraph. In effect, he was saying, if it ever comes back to me on remand, I'll remember. Well, they appealed anyway, but lost on the appeal. Guidelines. I want to say a bit about potential competition, which has received an enormous amount of attention of late. Potential competition theories essentially say that the acquiring firm, the purchaser, had it not been for the acquisition, would have entered that market anyway. Or the theory of perceived potential competition, even if the buyer was not planning to enter that market, other participants in the market perceived that it would. And as a result, it disciplined their competitive plans and kept them from raising prices or limiting quality. The US agencies brought a number of potential competition cases in the 1960s. Early, mid-70s, the Supreme Court starts pushing back. And the main focus of attention in the Supreme Court decisions is, tell us again how you know they were going to come in. And often the government said, well, I've got a document here. I do. Here we go. Here's a document. It talks about, it's in the product development group. It says, you know, we might be able to get in this market. And we're doing some research to do that. The court would say, that looks a little bit speculative to me. It says they're thinking of doing it, might do it, could do it. I don't see a firm plan there to come in the market. I see talking out loud, thinking about what could be happening. In the modern era, the Congress and a number of commentators is saying, where the buyer is a dominant enterprise, you have to police this kind of behavior aggressively. And they point to that appendix in the House report, not literally to that appendix, but to other compilations that have been done, and said, while Facebook, Google, Amazon were making one acquisition after another to reinforce their position of dominance, you did nothing but watch. Only in the smallest number of transactions did you stop Google from buying another company. But by and large, you did nothing. And they solidified positions of preeminence and acquired them because of your hands-off policy. There are two theories being advanced for intervention that are receiving a lot of traction in the US. One is the notion that there is a kill zone in which the incumbent looks about the landscape, looks at the fortress it has built, and it's looking for entrants who are creeping up on the fortress. And when it sees them, it buys them to squash them. That the whole point is to go to the target and say, I will give you a lot of money for your idea. I like it a lot. And then I take the idea and I put it on the shelf and I never use it. That's the kill zone. The other theory is that they do buy the company. They do give the acquired firm an expanded presence. That's Facebook, Instagram. Facebook did not put Instagram on the shelf. It developed it into a big line of its own operations with great vigor. But if you had not done that, that company you bought would have emerged as an independent competitive force. It would have gone to the capital markets on its own and grown, or it might have been purchased by a smaller enterprise, and the two of them would have emerged as a competitive threat. So that you did not kill them, you did nurture them, but there would have been a bigger competitive force if you'd never done this. The FTC pending inquiry of Facebook will be an interesting application of this concern. There are a couple of possible litigation paths. Probably the two transactions that get most of the attention in this debate are Instagram, WhatsApp, especially Instagram. The FTC could bring a challenge under the merger control law, the Clayton Act, to attack either of these deals and seek to unwind them. Or it could bring a monopolization case and say that the method of obtaining and protecting monopoly power was a series of acquisitions of smaller firms, and that the dominant enterprises rolled them up in order to build the fortress out and enhance its strength. My impression from what the FTC has been talking about is that they will use the monopolization theory. The FTC last week It appears on Wednesday afternoon, had a plenary executive session to talk about where the Facebook case is going. Where's the inquiry going? My impression is that by the end of the calendar year, maybe in November, early December, the FTC is going to bring a monopolization case against Facebook. And the core accusation is going to be, you are dominant and you became dominant or reinforced dominance. You maintained your monopoly position through the following acquisitions. Instagram and WhatsApp will be two of the main exhibits. With the possibility that the FTC says, what's the remedy going to be? You're going to spin off Instagram. They're going to operate as a social media platform on their own. What kind of proof will be relevant here? Well, certainly internal company records. If you watched a film of the greatest hits of the House of Representatives hearing with the 4 CEOs from July 29th, you'll see that Mark Zuckerberg was questioned intensively about an email exchange he had with the chief financial officer of Facebook. When the acquisition of Instagram is identified as a possibility, it sets off a discussion internally. And the CFO, upon getting a sense of the possible outlines of the acquisition, writes an email that says, Mark, why are we preparing to spend a lot of money on a company that doesn't even have 20 employees yet? 19. They've started out, they've got kind of a nice product, but wow, that's a rich price to pay for a small new company. And there's so many of them in Silicon Valley. Why this? And Mark writes back, and this is one of the emails that's framed and featured in the hearings. He says two things. Well, first, Instagram offers us a really nice complementary capability. The photo features, that's really nice. That'd fit well in our platform. So with the acquisition, we'll be able to pick up a new feature for our platform right away. It's a really nice idea, fits well in our portfolio. Oh, by the way, they're poised to emerge as a rival. If we don't do this, they're going to grow on their own. And as they grow, they're going to migrate into our neighborhood. And they'll probably pick up our customers. They will be seen as not a complement, but a substitute. And if we buy them, that won't happen. They'll be ours. The email doesn't say a whole lot more than that, but it says here are two reasons. One is complementary capability. Stop right there and think about traditional antitrust analysis. That's okay. Good. It's the second part that's attracted most of the attention. Ah, so you did see there were a rival. Aha. And you probably would have tried to develop this capability on your own, but you thought, let's buy them. They'll be ours, and we will control the future evolution of this product category. That's why we're going to do it. So one type of proof is you get records from inside the company that spell out what's going on and what they think is going to happen and what they think they could do themselves. Another suggested focal point, as I've just intimated, is the purchase price. Look at the enterprise being bought and look at how much is being paid. Now, is it inherently suspicious if someone would pay a billion, a few billion for a 19-person firm, scrapping and scrambling to get a foothold? Depends on the idea. Depends on the people. All of these companies realize that's how they started. Small, ambitious. So yeah, if you thought they were going to grow, you'd pay a lot. especially if you thought they might topple you. And if you didn't buy them, they'd be coming at you. Then maybe you'd pay a real premium to avoid having that take place. Another suggested approach is you look at the track record of acquisitions by the acquiring firm. You look at what the buyer has done. Do they have a habit of buying companies and shelving them, or have they bolstered the target? These all might be relevant in deciding what you do with a potential competition case. The DOJ recently brought a case that has some features of this. This was the DOJ case to Sabre Faralogics. These are both transportation sector services enterprises. Data sets and platforms involving airline transportation. DOJ said that Sabre, the Faralogics, was an up-and-coming emerging firm, and Sabre bought them. And that either Faralogics was going to expand and grow on its own because it was getting approval from customers of Sabre, or Sabre might put them aside, but Sabre would probably develop them, embrace them, because they had a nice product that people like. But DOJ's main argument was, you leave Faralogics on their own, they will be truly disruptive. They'll grow independently. Sabre ought not to be able to acquire them. The district court refused to enjoin the deal. And one of the main arguments that Sabre had made is, whoa, we are a two-sided platform. We join up two different groups. And users, airlines, what you've got to do is look at the effects on both sides of the platform. You can't just focus on one. You got to look at both. You've got to balance, weigh the competitive effects on both sides of the platform. And the court said, the Supreme Court decision that says this is so is Ohio versus Amex. This is the Sherman Act Section 1 case. This is the agreement case we talked about the first day, in which the Supreme Court says, in the credit system, the payment systems market, you have to look at the harm to merchants of a no steering policy and balance that against the benefit to American Express cardholders who get concierge services, points, other services as a consequence of the higher fees that merchants pay. That's in a Section 1 context. It's not a merger case. The Ohio Amex court said, oh, wow, the Supreme Court seems to be saying with multi-sided platforms, you've got to look at the effects on both sides of the platform. And I've got to do that too. I'm required to. Ohio Amex makes me do it, even though it's not a merger case. DOJ said, wait a minute. Philadelphia National Bank tells you don't do that. That's a Supreme Court case too, and it's a merger case. So don't do it. The court of first instance is saying, but Ohio Amex, that's very recent. And it seems to say, no, you got to look at both sides. Both sides have to do it. I'm doing it. And the court of first instance says, I'm bound to do it. I'm obliged to. And when I do that, the government doesn't win. At the same time, roughly a week after the adverse decision in the U.S. court in the District of Delaware, the United Kingdom Competition and Markets Authority issues a decision blocking the Sabre Faralogics deal. A 3-member panel in the CMA's panel system blocks it. The Department of Justice then goes to the Court of Appeals above the Court of First Instance in the U.S. and says, vacate that decision. It's moot now. Toss it out. Act as though it never existed. Because the parties have given up on their deal. They did. After the CMA moved to block the transaction, the parties said the deal's off. Although the parties, irritated by what happened in the UK, said, we're still going to pursue the appeal. Yeah, our deal is dead, but we think the analysis was wrong. And they are focusing on whether the UK, under its merger review system, had the requisite jurisdictional nexus in this deal to review the merger and prohibit it. So what happens after the district court decision? UK moves to block the deal, does block the deal. Parties abandon the transaction, Parties appeal to the Competition Appeal Tribunal in the UK. That's where that case sits now. DOJ goes to the Court of Appeals that sits above the US District Court and says, vacate the lower court's decision. Set it aside because it is moot regarding that transaction. Put it aside. And the Court of Appeals says, yes, we'll do that. So in a sense, the district court decision no longer has precedential value. It is as though it doesn't exist. It can't be cited in other litigation. But it is a fairly powerful indication of how the Supreme Court decision in the American Express two-sided platform market is applied to require the balancing of effects on both sides of the platform in a merger case. Arguably contradicts the principle in Philadelphia National Bank directly by saying you have to weigh the effects on both sides in order to come up with the net likely competitive effect of the merger. Oh, let me look a bit at the future here. A week from today, we have a presidential and congressional election. We're going to elect a president, and we're going to elect the members of our House of Representatives, all of them, and about 1/3 of the members of our Senate. What's going to happen? My crystal ball is not really good. If you saw my track record, you'd say, oh dear, why don't you just stop your talk right now and we'll just take some questions? Because about the only thing you're good at predicting is that the sun will come up in the east and it will set in the west. You're pretty good on that. But is it going to rain, snow, shine? Not so good. When it comes to elections, I was wrong about Brexit in 2016. I was wrong about the presidential election outcome. So that is the warning label on the treatment I'm about to give you. The big policy debates. What is certain to carry on is a big debate in the United States that I talked about in our first lecture about the goals of the US system. Consumer welfare versus citizen welfare. And there's no better statement of the citizen welfare perspective than that quotation from the Brown Shoe merger decision. Fragmented industries, small locally owned businesses. Court said we like that in merger control. What about structural standards? Can we bring back that slide of where the jurisprudence was in the Supreme Court circa 1975? Should we bring that back? A number of members of Congress say yes. And one variant of that is to say, if you have dominance, and they define dominance as the European Union defines dominance, that means 40%, not 70 or 80. If you are dominant and you carry out a merger, the presumption is it is illegal. It's a rebuttable presumption. How do you rebut it? I suppose you can make entry arguments, you can make efficiency claims. But arguments about entry and efficiency tend to be problematic. They're highly uncertain. You're making predictions about what's going to happen. And a court says, that's a nice theory, but what proof do you have for that? On what basis do I know that these predictions about who might, could, will come in the market will actually come to pass? Or that all these benefits you're going to realize by combining complementary skills, joining up different production facilities. How do I know that's going to be good? You can give some data, you can give some experience, but at a basic point, you're saying, Your Honor, this is our prediction. We think it's a good one. And the court might say, conceptually plausible. Likely, I can't say that, you lose. That's just to say, if you look at US experience, if you are forced to prove efficiency claims, that may amount to being a burden that nobody in the ordinary course is going to be able to satisfy. And you're going to lose. So are these rebuttable presumptions, in fact, going to be conclusive? A similar type of prohibition is you tell dominant firms 40% up, you cannot buy a competitor, a small competitor, never. You can't buy a small firm that's making a product that would be a complement. No. Nor can you buy a small firm that is making a product that could conceivably enable them to compete with you in the future in any sense. Most broadly, you can't buy a new tech firm at all, whatever they do. You're just out. Another proposal, should we unwind completed transactions? During her presidential primary campaign, Elizabeth Warren named 10 deals. She said, I'm going to tell my agencies to unwind them. I will direct them to do it, including some we've talked about. Will the agencies go about doing that anyway, whether or not there's new legislation? The FTC decision in the Facebook investigation will give us a clue of that. I think they will. And is tougher merger control a good idea going ahead? One major line of research has been looking at how mergers actually work out in practice. How often do parties realize their efficiency objectives? A new paper by Nancy Rose, who headed the Department of Justice Economics Analysis Group in the Antitrust Division for 2 years during the Barack Obama presidency, and Jonathan Sallet, who worked in the Federal Communications Commission and the Department of Justice. They have a new paper coming out that says mergers frequently do not work as planned. They do not generate the benefits. And their implication for that is, in merger control, you're not often going to make mistakes by blocking deals that are premised on big benefits, because the benefits so often don't come about. So don't worry about doing this. And for God's sakes, don't worry at 3-2, 4-3, 5-4, 6-5. Further question is, if you make it tough for big companies to buy startups, do you get fewer startups? Is that the vision or dream that gets new entrepreneurs up early in the morning and working hard because they envision the big buyout? Those who want more aggressive control say, maybe sometimes, but the benefit of preserving their competitive presence is greater than the chilling effect of keeping them out. And by the way, we don't think they'll stay out. Maybe they'll only get $1 billion from a smaller firm. That's not so bad. Maybe they won't get $5 billion. Maybe, God forbid, they'll only get $100 million for the buyout. And the question is, how many of you in the audience, how many of you, if you had $100 million on the sidewalk, would just step by and say, I'm not picking that up. That's only $100 million. I do not bend over and pick up an amount of currency on the sidewalk unless it is 1 billion. I will bend over and count it. But if it's short of $1 billion, I won't take it. The argument of the proponents is nobody thinks that way. You're still going to get startups. And if they're not absorbed by big firms, they will become competitive threats. These are the focal points for discussion going ahead. If the Biden administration prevails, if they win, Biden wins, depends in part on who gets appointed to the agencies. Does President Biden appoint Rohit Chopra to chair the FTC? He can do that by just signing a letter. That's all it takes. Whomever he picks, either a neo-Brandeisian, because he tells Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, part of my deal with you is you get to run one of these agencies. You get the FTC. I'm going to keep the Department of Justice. There's a good chance that one of those two agencies will be headed by a declared, committed neo-Brandeisian who wants the big agenda with the big goals framework and the big enforcement program. There'll be an expanded litigation agenda, tougher merger enforcement, even in losing cases, and a big push for legislative reforms. All of our polls are saying Biden's going to win, and he's going to take the Senate and House with him. He's going to get the control of the Congress. That creates the foundation for a bolder program of legislative reform. Maybe not the complete package that the House Majority Staff Report asked for, but maybe major elements like tougher merger control in particular. And my thought is, if you were devising a strategy that maximized your chances of getting through the Congress with measures more quickly, you do mergers first and you pick up the other stuff later. Mergers first. And maybe you focus on dominant enterprises. And you say, we're going to start there. And yes, Biden will pick different judges, but Donald Trump, if he is out of office by the end of January, will have selected about 25% of all federal judges in the judiciary system, with intervention skepticism on their mind when it comes to business. And 3 members of the Supreme Court, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Neil Gorsuch, with an active coalition of 6 skeptics. You won't change the courts overnight. If you really want to change what the courts do, you're going to have to get legislation, and you're going to have to try riskier cases. I think if Trump wins, he'll continue bringing cases. He hates the tech sector. He does not have friends there. They're not giving him a penny. They make fun of him. They wish that he loses. I think that if he wins, he's going to say, you ain't seen nothing yet. Get ready, because here I come. And he might even throw his weight between some legislative reform measures, so that will be harder to accomplish in the Senate itself. I've used more time than I expected. We've got about 15 minutes until we reach the top of the hour, but I'd be glad to take your questions and comments. So, Bruno, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It's from 20 years I've been learning about U.S. antitrust law, and we all know about the pendulum in the U.S. And I have to confess that I've never seen such a potential shift in the pendulum as I'm seeing today. I'm not sure if it's just my perspective here, but one question I would like to ask you, Professor, is whether this seems to be more aligned with the European standards, and what is the perspective of this shift in the pendulum to actually influence emerging country authorities all around the world with respect to more antitrust enforcement?
This is unmistakably a move in the direction of aligning the United States system more closely with the European system. Indeed, when you look at the legislative proposals, not only is there an effort in those proposals as a technical matter to redefine the operative concept as dominance rather than monopoly. So the US regime, if it were reset in the vision of the House subcommittee report, would replace monopolization with abusive dominance as the operative concept for Section 2 of the Sherman Act. And it would use dominance as 40% to impose these new controls on big tech mergers. So that's a clear import. And the philosophy of the European regime that dominant firms have the special responsibility to forbear in a growing number of circumstances would be taken on directly in the US regime with a more demanding form of merger review. Although it's very interesting in the UK, certainly in the European Commission, notice that scrutiny of European Commission decisions in merger cases has not been laissez-faire by the General Court in Luxembourg. Vodafone is a pretty powerful indication of that. And in the UK, although we don't know what the CAT is going to see in Sabre Fair Logics, and it may focus on the jurisdictional issue, not so much on substance. The CAT has been a pretty demanding tribunal. So what is interesting in these jurisdictions is to see the courts asserting themselves as a source of guidance, imposing demands on what the public institutions do. So in the US, even if you changed some of the framework, the judiciary still would have a major interpretational role to play. And it's a judiciary that is not welcoming of a broader regime. But I think completely in terms of specific technical detail and philosophy, the US framework as proposed in the new neo-Brandeisian vision converges significantly on the EU regime. And we also see a convergence on the view that antitrust is not enough. That's why the executive vice president, Vestager, who's also the commissioner for competition, is pushing so hard for the Digital Services Act in the European Union, and she will get it. And she is aided very strongly by the Commissioner for Internal Market, Thierry Breton, also pushing very hard for this. Exact outlines to be determined, but it includes many
Alessandra, eu tô interfonando aqui para você, tô aqui na portaria.
features that you see suggested and recommended
ou deixe aí na porta.
in the House
Tem mais uma
package.
caixa do correio também.
Sorry, Professor. I think we had some interruption. I think we have, let's open the floor for direct questions. I think we have a question from Danielle. Danielle, do you want to raise the question directly?
Yes, thank you, Professor Kovacic, for this insightful lecture. Actually, I have one question here, but just one follow-up of what you have just said. We have just seen that Biden agenda on environmental issues will coincide to the European ones to have a carbon-free country by 2050. Do you think that this will push the theory more towards what Europe is doing and to the new Brandeisian features? And if I can ask, my question here is, if you can just briefly explain what the cellophane fallacy theory is all about, and do you think that it can be used to the relevant market definition of the digital market? Sorry for making not connected questions.
No, they're fine. On the first one, I expect that the new administration will indeed converge on green policies as they've developed in the European Union as well. I think that he will face a revolt in his party among the progressives if he does not do this. Though in the campaign, he's hedging a bit. One of the flashpoint issues is fracking. Hydraulic fracking is a way of extracting hydrocarbons in subterranean structures. That became widespread in the US over the past decade, in particular because surface property ownership in the United States also entitles the surface property subterranean minerals. The government does not own the subterranean minerals, and those decisions are a matter of member state law. And many member states said, yes, especially member states that were suffering from an economic downturn, like Pennsylvania, which is one of the key states in the coming election. Pennsylvania went forcefully ahead for fracking, and it became a major element of the economic infrastructure of the state. Biden has been asked, because the Greens want it, stop it, end it. Biden has hedged. He said, at one point was saying, I'll let it go ahead, but only if it's really safe. Interpretation, I'm going to cut it way back. In the latest debate, Trump asked him, are you going to stop it? Are you going to get us out of the hydrocarbon fuel cycle? Are you going to do that? He said, yes. So petroleum sector is going to die. Yes. Trump is portraying that as petroleum sector is going to die, fracking is going to die, and this guy will kill it. Biden is being very, very strategic on this, because if he tells Pennsylvania, yes, I am going to kill fracking in this state because it will save the planet, they will say, that's good for you, but we are not going to save you. He thinks he will lose if he says that. If he wins, I think he reverts to a green strategy in a fairly significant way, and you'll see convergence. You'll see the Paris Accords, we will be back in. Lots of the green measures will be embraced in the Biden administration, though in some states there'll be resistance to how you do that. Maybe you buy them off by giving them transitional assistance. I think cellophane does become important. Now, the argument made in cellophane involved flexible wrapping materials. And the government said, cellophane, DuPont, you're a monopolist. And one of the reasons you're a monopolist is you have key patents. And it means that nobody really can challenge you effectively. And DuPont's argument was, that's not true. Every time we try to raise the price, it attracts substitutes. All the time. We try to raise the price, it attracts substitutes. They come in all the time. And the Supreme Court said, that's right. Here's all this evidence of people coming in when you raise the price. The government unsuccessfully argued, and this is why it's called the Cellophane Fallacy, because many commentators agree. The government said, there is substitution only because you're already charging a monopoly price. And for any product, if you raise the price high enough, there will be substitute. If the price of flying an airplane, riding on a train, riding in a motor coach, or driving a car becomes so high, I will ride a bicycle from Washington to New York City. That's about 300 kilometers. I'll do it if it's the only way to get there. I might even walk. At some point, I'll switch. But it doesn't mean that the other means of transport are not relevant markets in which I can exercise market power. So the cellophane fallacy is the tendency to equate entry and expansion by rivals with a lack of monopoly power. The question that has to be asked is, do you already have it? And for digital, we probably won't be looking at prices necessarily. We might have to look at other variables of competition. That is, when do people switch? At what point do they go to other browsing mechanisms? When do qualitative factors cause that to take place? That's going to be a challenge for the government in its Google case, because Google is saying the only reason we keep our existing users is by giving them a really good product. And the moment we don't do that, they go someplace else. And the government's the government, in a sense, is arguing a variant of the argument that failed in cellophane. Was the only reason they move or ever move is you make things so unbearable that they'll try something else. But ordinarily, the fact that they don't move is a reflection on how sticky switching is and how willing people are to change existing patterns of behavior.
Thank you, Professor. Do we have any other question that anyone would like to raise directly? If so, please open your microphone and ask Professor. Otherwise, I think we are 1 minute past 12 now. Professor, in the name of IBRAC, in the name of everyone that has been attending our classes here, we thank you a lot for this opportunity. It has been great. It has been bringing light to us of what is going on in the US. For good or for bad, it seems to be approaching the European standard for a lot of the discussions. Let's see how
that is where we're going. Yes.
Yeah. Let's see how the elections will come out. Let's see your predictions and how this can affect even our enforcement here in Brazil. So again, Professor, I couldn't thank you more for this opportunity in the name of everyone here. Unfortunately, Lauro had to leave for a commitment with CADI, but he asked me to thank you again. And of course, we're going to have several other opportunities when we can debate what is going on in both sides of the world here. So thanks again, Professor.
The pleasure is on my side. I am most grateful for the chance to have been with you these past 3 weeks, and I look forward to the time when we can meet in person and do this in a much more human manner than simply on the screen. But I'm thrilled to have the chance to do this with you, and I'm delighted. You might gather I enjoy this, and thank you for the chance to look at this and to speak about these with you. And I look forward to next time.
Thank you. For hopefully next time we'll be in person here in Brazil in a nice venue. Let's see if we can arrange that.
Amen.
Thanks to everyone as well. And I just would like to remember everyone that on the 10th to 13th of November, we're going to have our IBRAC seminar, the international one. You can enroll yourself, register yourself at the IBRAC website. We're going to release the full program probably today, so you can take a view. A lot of the debates we had today are going to be rediscussed on the event. So I hope everyone can make it as well. Thanks to all. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Bruno. Thanks, folks.